The following program contains scenes that some viewers may find disturbing.
Gorgeous. Okay, very nice.
Hollywood can be a very dark place.
He ran in circles with people that had criminal records.
The suspect wanted him dead.
There was a lot of blood everywhere. He's a little bit of a shady character.
How did he get himself in this?
Now we have a race against the clock.
Hollywood, California, home to the Dream Factory, a magnet for starstruck hopefuls flocking here from all over the world.
It's just a hodgepodge of colorful characters. Hopefully you're just in the right place at the right time and not in the wrong place at the wrong time.
It runs the range from narcotics dealers, gang members, all the way up to Hollywood celebrities.
For a lucky few, Tinseltown means fame and fortune. For others, it's a boulevard of broken dreams.
At that time, there were a lot of violent crimes.
It seemed like a normal day in the City of Angels. Two photographers are gearing up for a routine photo shoot.
Jean-Paul Mann had an appointment with a close friend and business associate, Roland Kuster.
So he made a couple of phone calls into Roland, and he didn't get any response to the phone call. So he went over there. He noticed that a large picture window had been smashed out.
The studio is eerily quiet. Something isn't right.
He walked upstairs and he discovered his friend in the bedroom.
Roland was hanging off the bed. There was a lot of blood everywhere.
Minutes later, LAPD homicide detectives John Thacker and Tom Small are racing to the crime scene.
Certainly was one of the more violent cases that I had seen. The brutality that was exacted on him personally was pretty rough.
The blood spatter indicated to me this was an exceptionally violent fight that took place. What that told me was the suspect wanted him dead.
But why would anyone kill this handsome and popular photographer?
Roland was the coolest. He was really chill and pleasant to be around.
Okay, look this way, and beautiful, and gorgeous.
He was very humble. He was very chic and very elegant.
Beautiful, excellent stuff. Hand up, left hand up, gorgeous.
He was friends with everybody. Even people that he did business with, everybody, like Roland.
Kuster's background was a world away from Hollywood. He came from Basel, Switzerland. After stints shooting in Europe and Japan, he followed his dream to LA. At 37, he was a talented photographer on the cusp of mainstream success. And now, he's dead.
Mr. Kuster sustained a total of 26 stab and slash wounds. He also sustained multiple blunt force trauma to his head and face.
There was a broken statue that was covered in blood. It was a heavy porcelain statue. And I forget what it was, but it was obviously used to hit him hard enough to break the statue in half. Roland had some hair in his hand. Our criminalist was able to pull that out and book it as evidence. The perpetrator had rifled through some clothing in an adjacent closet. There was blood on the clothing.
One of the first things that came to my mind was whoever this suspect is was going through the victim's belongings looking for items and property of value to take. Was it somebody he knew, or was it a random act?
Months earlier, the offer of a large, cheap space had brought Roland Kuster to the heart of Hollywood. But there was a downside. Pop Studios, where he lived and worked, is in an edgy neighborhood, and drug-fueled crimes are commonplace.
It's a high-crime area, a lot of street people, people involved in using or selling drugs.
There's a lot of gangs out there, and you know, you get a lot of sort of dubious characters running around Hollywood. It can be a very dark place.
So we thought, well, that might have some bearing on what occurred here.
Pop Studios was fortified with a chain link fence around the entire perimeter.
It was still under cover of darkness, especially at the time of the morning that we believe the crime occurred. That would be very easy for somebody to blend in and just walk right on out of there.
Is this a home invasion? Is this a random act where somebody broke into the house and caught Mr. Kuster unaware?
So everybody asked this question mark, what happened? What happened? Who did it?
Well, when I heard what had happened to him, I thought maybe there was more than one person. I knew that Roland was strong and he was quick, and not in the sense of as a fighter, but just his nature. You know, I knew that he could be fast and he was strong. So I was thinking, how could, you know, one person just overwhelm him?
We had a window smash. We speculated that he just hopped through the window.
In the crime scene were several bloody footprints leading out of the front door.
Detectives Thacker and Small find more blood evidence in an upstairs bathroom.
There was blood drops on the sink itself, and there was a napkin in the trash can covered in blood. Somebody got cut. We had a bleeder.
If this is the killer's blood, investigators have found crucial evidence. But it will only be useful if and when they identify a potential suspect.
There is a very good chance that the suspect in this case had cut himself, injured himself during this struggle, and there is an exceptionally good chance that some of Mr. Kuster's blood had transferred onto this suspect.
I try to be as methodical in my approach to every case, but it was pretty apparent right from the ground floor walking up that this was going to be a little bit different. Basically, it's a whodunit.
Later that day, the detectives catch a break. Two eyewitnesses come forward.
Officers who are protecting the perimeter of our crime scene were approached by two females who were coming back home from work. These females told him that they saw someone jumping over the chain link fence in front of Mr. Kuster's residence at approximately 5:40 that morning.
It was a male black, and he was anywhere from 5'7" to 6 feet tall. He had a red ball cap on.
The man was wearing an avocado green-colored tank top. He was wearing shorts. He was carrying a pair of shoes, yellow or mustard color.
The exact location where they said they saw him go over the fence, we found blood, and it was fresh.
So it was huge for us.
The bloodstained trail will help lead the police to the killer. But without a suspect in sight, this case is far from over. In a rundown part of Hollywood, a photographer has been savagely murdered. At first glance, it looks like a burglary gone wrong. Detectives John Thacker and Tom Small ask Roland Kuster's friends to help search his studio for any missing items.
To the best of their knowledge, nothing had been removed from the residence.
We were able to basically rule out robbery as a motive. That left us with the potential for a drug-related frenzy or a crime of passion. That's a possibility.
The detectives shift their focus to the hours before Roland's death.
They told us the night before the murder, Mr. Kuster had visitors.
He was doing a photo shoot, and he had lined up another job along with his friend, Jean-Paul Mann, for the next day.
He was doing more commercial work, but he didn't care about that stuff. I think for him, he was just trying to make things work and keep his head above water.
He was trying to attain a certain status in the Hollywood community and dealing with the top-level people in the business.
It was sort of a bohemian artist den, you know?
So this place there was always beautiful girls coming in. Plus, he was a good-looking guy.
After they left, Roland Kuster had some friends over. The people that were at the party were Roland's girlfriend. John McGinnis, he was a friend of Roland Kuster, an associate through the photography business. He had someone that worked for him by the name of Rodney Kate.
They brought a third individual to the house and introduced this person to Mr. Kuster. This was the first time they had met. This individual's name is Brandon Stevens.
And they were all drinking, partying, just having conversation.
Midway through the party, Roland's girlfriend calls it a night. Little does she know, his goodbye kiss will be their last. Detectives want to know what went on after she left. The 3 remaining partygoers are the last to see Roland Kuster alive.
John McGinnis and Rodney Cate and Brandon Stevens are all potential suspects.
They quickly track down John McGinnis and Rodney Cate, but they can't find Brandon Stevens.
John McGinnis and Rodney Cate told us that they were partying with the victim. They were drinking alcohol. They did some drugs.
Roland was careful who he let in his life, but he was very free-spirited. You know, he loved life, and he was just in the moment.
Within his circle of friends, there were some people involved in narcotics use and sales.
Roland Kuster ran in with friends that were not only professional photographers, actresses, models. He ran in circles with people that had criminal records. You know, they were friends of his. Rodney Cate was friends with Brandy Stevens. That's how Brandy Stevens gets into the mix.
He was working in the movie industry. He was a grip, and he also did a lot of design, so he could do some construction and that kind of thing. He's kind of a carpenter. He's always been creative, and he let that show in a lot of ways. As he got older, he wrote poetry. He's very artistic in that he draws. He's a fabulous cook. And I think he was also doing some things that he didn't want me to know about.
He had a little bit of drug history.
He's a little bit of a shady character.
Under questioning, Roland's friends drop a bombshell.
His 2 friends told us that Brandon Stevens was wearing a green shirt, shorts, and a red baseball cap.
Is this the man witnesses saw jumping over the fence the morning of the murder?
We know in our guts that he is involved in this murder.
The police pressed them for more, and John McGinnis and Rodney Cate reveal what happened when the party broke up.
It was getting pretty late, and Mr. Kuster had to get up for an early morning shoot, so the party was winding down, and he was asking people to, you know, time to go, folks. Got to get some rest.
Brandon Stevens spent the night with Rodney Cate after they left.
Rodney Cate's residence was within just a few miles of Roland's house.
The police wonder if Brandon could have slipped away, killed Kuster, and snuck back into Rodney's house before dawn.
The friend had no idea when he got up and when he left, but he provided us with enough information to make us believe that he was out the door somewhere between, 3 and 7 a.m. All he knows is that when he did leave, he left his shoes, which were a pair of combat boots. So he goes to work with no shoes on. We thought that was a little unusual.
The suspect was carrying a pair of shoes as he hopped over that fence. The reason he was carrying the shoes is because they were bloody and he did not want to leave a trail behind.
If someone said to me, Brandon went to work without his shoes because he couldn't find them, I would say, I understand that. That's Brandon. Brandon is someone who marches to his own drummer.
For the police, tracking down Brandon Stevens is priority number 1. In the meantime, They look again at evidence found at the crime scene. One discovery stands out.
In the actual room where Roland's body was lying, John and I observed a backpack.
Inside this black backpack was paperwork addressed to David Miner at the Avenal State Prison in California.
It's not even addressed to Roland Custer. None of it made really any sense to us. Now, why is it there?
It's been a week since photographer Roland Custer was slain in his Hollywood studio. Detectives are hunting for prime suspect Brandon Stevens. But other evidence points in a new direction. Prison inmate David Miner's name is on an envelope in a backpack found beside the victim's bed.
The envelope gave a CDC number, which is a Department of Corrections number assigned to every inmate in prison.
We discovered that David Miner was in fact a parolee recently released from Avenal State Prison.
David Miner was an individual who had been in trouble with the law for a long time. He had numerous prior contacts with the police. So he was someone who was transient, a bit of a drifter who just happened to frequent the Hollywood area.
Our victim had a tendency to hang out with people that had criminal records. So it wasn't necessarily something unusual to find.
To cover all their bases, the detectives checked Miner's fingerprints against those lifted from the crime scene. No match.
We had initially run David Miner through every system we could figure out the first week of the murder. Nothing came back.
Today, everyone's required to give a DNA sample when they're convicted of a felony in California, but at the time, there was no DNA bank, and so we were unable to find any DNA to compare to the blood that was found at the scene.
Even so, Thacker and Small want to talk to the newly released parolee.
David Miner's parole agent provided us with an address where David Miner was supposed to be residing. Armed with that information, officers went out to the address that was given. It was a non-existent address.
And he was put in the system as a PAL, which is a parolee at large. And there was a warrant for his arrest.
Roland Custer had big dreams. Not content with snapping headshots for Hollywood hopefuls, Custer was a serious photographer who also dabbled in sculpture. But his ambitions went beyond making art.
He was designing a park for homeless kids. His biggest passion was this park. He was really driven to make this thing happen. He was really trying to do something beautiful.
It was a tough neighborhood, but Custer liked the scent of danger. A week goes by. The police can't locate David Miner, but they do find their prime suspect, Brandon Stevens. He's hauled into the station for questioning.
He admitted to being at the residence of Mr. Custer the night before the murder.
But said it was the only time he'd ever been there. He had a good idea of the layout of the place. Nobody else seemed to have that kind of information.
Knowing the details already, detectives pressure him to describe the clothes he was wearing that night.
He told us that he was wearing a white t-shirt. This was after his two friends told us that he had been wearing an avocado green t-shirt.
At one point, he said he didn't wear hats. They made him claustrophobic. But if he did wear a hat, he'd wear it backwards.
He also said that he did not use any drugs that night because he doesn't react well to drugs and because drugs freak him out. That was also contrary to what his two friends told us. They said he partook of cocaine just like they did.
Investigators have good reason to believe the friends. The autopsy proves Kuster did coke the night he died. Yet, despite their suspicions, detectives don't have enough to hold Brandon Stevens. Before releasing him, they take his driver's license photo.
And we assembled a photo array and we put Brandy Stevens in that photo lineup. Went back to the women that happened to see that male black scaling the fence.
One of the women immediately points to the photograph of Brandon Stevens and says, "That's him." The second woman looks at the photograph. She points to the photograph of Brandon Stevens and says, "I think that's him."
With the IDs of two eyewitnesses, the investigation of Brandon Stevens kicks into high gear. Police secure a warrant to search his home, where they find even more damning evidence.
We came up with a avocado-colored shirt and recovered a red ball cap, as described by the women that observed the suspect going over the fence. We had some critical evidence there.
Investigators obtain a second warrant to collect samples of his DNA.
Brandon was detained, taken into the police station.
He provided us with hair, saliva.
Brandon waived his rights and began talking to us. During that interview is where he contradicted himself, changed his story that he previously provided to us. He admitted to wearing an avocado green t-shirt the night before the murder.
When detectives ask about the party, he also changes his tune.
At first, he said he only drank. Then later on, he said he might have smoked a bud, which is marijuana. As his story kept on deviating, it seemed to us that he was covering up, making things up as he went, lied to us about his clothing that he was wearing. We offered him a polygraph exam. He agreed. And he went in there and he completely bombed it. Almost every aspect of the test. He was deceptive. His story just didn't connect right. And he was kind of all over the map. When we told him, hey, you blew this test, you're lying, obviously, about something. And then he came clean. He said, yeah, I was doing lines of cocaine. I might have blacked out.
But it's what Stevens says next that changes the game.
He said, yeah, I guess I could have done it, but I don't remember doing it, but it's possible.
Weeks after the police find fashion photographer Roland Kuster stabbed to death in his blood-splattered studio, the police arrest Brandon Stevens for murder.
He said that he could have done it, but he just doesn't remember. So at that point, with the evidence in hand, the changing stories and everything else combined, it gave us a feeling that we need to hold him. He got booked for murder.
My first inclination when I heard that Brandon had been arrested was, how could they? I was absolutely livid and scared. My next reaction was, how did he get himself in this?
It looks as though police have found the man who took the life of this gifted young photographer.
When I found out that they found this guy that murdered him, all kinds of things were running through my head. I was more saddened for him. Roland was like a calm water, like a smooth, just curling, beautiful wave. He had a sweet sensitivity to him.
LA Deputy DA Craig Hum weighs the evidence against Brandon Stephens before pressing charges.
There were a couple of things that linked Brandon to the crime. First of all, and probably most importantly, he was actually identified by two witnesses. There was also a connection to the victim in that he had been with the victim the evening before the murder.
But the forensic tests tell a different story. The hair caught in the photographer's grip isn't Stephens, but Kuster's own hair.
When he was involved in whatever scuffle he was involved in before his death, speculation is he just put his hand behind his head or grabbed his hair. By that time, it was over. We obtained over 52 prints from the location, and some of those came back with hits, but they're all on people that you would expect to find in there. None of them came back to Randy Stephens.
And there's another large chink in the case against Stephens.
We were able to identify Nikes as the potential source of the bloody footprint.
Brandon was wearing boots that night, and those boots, which were recovered, definitely did not match the bloody shoe print.
The evidence against Brandon Stephens is crumbling, but he's not off the hook yet.
We elected not to file charges against Brandon Stephens at that time, pending the results of forensic testing, specifically DNA testing on the blood that was found at the scene.
No criminal charges were filed, so he was released within 48 hours.
I could not imagine Brandon having done something like that. I just could not imagine.
Yes, it was frustrating not having the case come together sooner than later. You don't know what you're getting into until you get to the bottom of it. We still had another lead to pursue. That lead was finding David Miner.
12 weeks after the homicide, investigators are even more eager to track Miner down when incriminating new information comes to light. By chance, Miner was picked up by the police the day of Roland Kuster's murder.
David Miner's parole agent tells us, oh, by the way, I received a phone call from some officers on May the 9th. The day of the murder, David Miner was found in his boxers scratched up and bloody. He was trying to hide while crawling through backyards of residences in the Hollywood Hills.
And he's looking inside houses and doing what bad guys do.
David Miner had numerous scratches and abrasions over various parts of his body. He had cuts to his arms.
And he's going through people's yards and he's drinking from their garden hoses.
The residents in the area called thinking that he was a burglar.
And there was a security officer on patrol up there and detains him. We're still at the crime scene when this is going on.
The security guard hands David Miner over to an LA patrol unit.
These police officers just came on watch. with their watch commanders and their staff, and they hadn't been apprised of the murder yet. So when they have David Miner at the station, they couldn't find anything to pin on him. Nobody really knew about the murder yet. And so he walked out the door.
They didn't know we had this crime scene going, and unfortunately, the parole agent did not provide us with this information the first time we spoke to him. We didn't know that they had this individual detained.
So we never got that information until July. And then when we got it in July, you got David Miner here, and we got this information found in the crime scene. We put two and two together.
With the letter, the backpack, and his strange behavior, the evidence against Miner is mounting. The police also learn of a possible connection between the killer and the victim, Roland Kuster.
Pop Studios was in the heart of the Hollywood area. It is blocks away from the Hollywood Hills where David Miner was found.
That building itself had been a location used by drug dealers and users, abusers. We had information that it was a shooting gallery. You know, a lot of hypes go in there and they inject their cocaine, their heroin, whatever.
And it's certainly possible, given that David Miner was known to frequent that area and had drug involvement, that he had been to the location before it became a residence and before it was being used by Roland.
What's more, David Miner also fits the description of the man jumping over the fence.
If you put a photograph of David Miner beside Brandon Stevens, you'd say they're brothers. They have the same complexion, they have the same stature. You could easily mistake one for the other.
So now there's a manhunt for David Miner.
A major manhunt is underway for David Miner, the prime suspect in the murder of fashion photographer Roland Kuster.
We were tracking his movements, trying to determine where he's at. Part of the investigation led us to DPSS, which is Department of Public Social Services, to see if maybe he's obtaining funding. A lot of these guys get out of prison, immediately they go sign up down there for money until they can find a job. We found that he had received some funding already in the Hollywood area. So we did some follow-up work in various locations where he went to get money. And we were just a step behind him.
David Miner was nowhere to be found.
As the search for Miner heats up, the case against Brandon Stevens turns ice cold. 12 weeks after the killing, the DNA results deliver the final blow.
The blood evidence did not match his. Ultimately, the DNA evidence collected from Brandon Stevens was not in that crime scene, and in particular, it was not found on the top of the chain link fence where the suspect was seen.
It looks like Brandon Stevens, once a prime suspect, had nothing to do with the murder of Roland Kuster.
He was, I'm going to say, a wreck. We talked about it a little bit, but it was very painful for him. They let him go, but there was nothing that said, you're exonerated, or that we made a mistake, or anything like that.
And it wasn't until we were fully finished with the efforts related to Brandon Stevens that we were able to devote 100% of our time to hunting this second suspect down.
Then, homicide detectives catch a break when Miner uses his parole ID to register at a homeless shelter. This triggers an alert in the fugitive database.
We discovered that David Miner was receiving general relief benefits in Atlanta, Georgia.
So we gave them the information and sent out a photo.
An Atlanta fugitive squad officer calls the LA detectives with news.
He checked in here. He's somewhere in the Atlanta area, but we expect him to come back to this location. He can get meals, he can shower, he can get some fresh clothing, and he can get paid. So we're going to sit on it, and we'll let you know what happens. And a couple days later, we get a phone call. Hey, we got your guy in custody. Well, Atlanta had him booked as a fugitive based on the PAL warrant, the parolee at large. They took him into custody and brought him into the Fulton County Jail in Atlanta.
My partner and I went to Atlanta, Georgia, for the purpose of procuring a search warrant and obtaining David Miner's blood.
Detectives finally lay eyes on the man they have been hunting for the murder of Roland Kuster.
Mr. Miner was mad that he was there. When he realized that it was blood, hair, and saliva that we were after, I think he kind of put together what we were there for.
He was removed from the Fulton County Jail and then taken to a contract hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. He allowed us to draw his blood without any troubles. It was not until we were driving back to the Fulton County Jail where he abruptly inquired of us, "Are you guys from Hollywood?" That was a very telling statement for us. He knew what was going on. He knew what this was about.
Then I think it sunk in. It was pretty apparent that he had nothing to tell us.
David Miner was taken into custody for his parole violation and extradited to Los Angeles after several months in Atlanta, Georgia. That was exciting. It was exciting having David Miner in custody.
He denied any knowledge of the murder, denied ever having had any contact with Roland, claimed he didn't know who he was, claimed that he had never been at his residence. That was, unfortunately for him, a big mistake because his possessions were found at Roland's residence.
Miner never confessed. He asked us if we had a motive. He asked us if anything had been stolen from the residence. He then stated, "If I would have done it, I would have stolen something from the residence." And he told us we couldn't prove our case because we had no witnesses.
Because he was a suspect in a murder, obviously the detectives wanted him held as long as possible while the DNA was processed.
Now we have a race against the clock. What we need to do is get a sufficient amount of David Miner's DNA compared to the evidence at the crime scene in order to obtain a filing.
After months of effort, the investigators' persistence pays off. The unidentified blood in Roland Kuster's residence belongs to David Miner.
The suspect's blood was found at the scene. It was found on a tissue in an upstairs bathroom. And it was also found on the escape route, the location where the eyewitnesses had seen someone fleeing from the residence.
One of the most important pieces of evidence we were able to tie him to through DNA, was a blood sample taken from a coat hanging in a closet of a second bedroom on the second floor. This blood evidence showed a mixture of David Miner and Roland Kuster. The blood was mixed together.
And so at that point, a case was filed against him for the murder of Roland Kuster. A warrant was issued and he was brought down from prison, and then the court proceedings began.
1 year after Roland Kuster was murdered, David Miner is charged with killing him. At the trial, investigators described the chain of events leading up to the murder.
David Miner was looking for a place to put his head. He found Pop Studios as the perfect location to do that.
Prosecutors argue that in the early morning hours of May 9, 1997, David Miner smashed a window to gain entry to Roland Kuster's studio.
Roland would have heard the noise of the breaking glass. When the suspect went up to the second floor, he was confronted by Roland.
Grabbing a knife from the kitchen, Miner stabs the victim repeatedly in the chest and neck. Then he bludgeons him with a statue.
He was looking for money, contraband, drugs, something.
By now, Miner is covered in blood, Roland's and his own.
And he was trying to stop the bleeding and clean it off.
To avoid leaving any more footprints, he removes his shoes, but forgets his backpack. He jumps over the fence, where he's seen by the two witnesses. Hours later, he is found in the Hollywood Hills using a garden hose to clean off the remnants of his bloody crime. 2 years after the murder, a jury takes less than a day to find David Miner guilty. He is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
This, to me, is a cautionary tale, and especially artists, that aren't really paying attention, to their surroundings. So, they become vulnerable.
You wear this case, and you wear it for the rest of your life. I wouldn't say as a matter of course I get any joy out of it, because it's tragic all the way around.
Though exonerated, Brandon Stevens never recovers from his arrest. He has been in and out of prison ever since.
I only have one thing to say. I feel like I've lost my son.